There is a small moment that happens to many people every day. You sit down to begin something simple, a piece of work, a message you meant to finish, a page you wanted to read. The room is quiet enough. The task is not especially difficult, and yet something strange happens. Your hand reaches for your phone, almost before the thought forms. A notification glows. A vibration passes through the table like a tiny pulse. You glance at it just for a second. Then another tab opens. Another message. Another small piece of information drifting across the surface of your attention. A few minutes later, you look up, slightly disoriented. The task is still there, waiting in the same place you left it. And somewhere beneath the surface, a quiet question begins to form. Why is it so hard to stay with one thing? Not for hours, sometimes not even for a few minutes. It can feel personal, like a small private failure, as if somewhere inside the mind, a certain kind of discipline has quietly disappeared. But if you pause for a moment and look a little closer at the architecture of the world surrounding you, another possibility begins to appear. Because the difficulty may not be inside the mind at all. It may be in the environment the mind now lives inside. There is a particular kind of silence that used to exist in ordinary life. Not the dramatic silence of empty landscapes or quiet libraries, but the gentle background quiet that once surrounded daily moments. The quiet of waiting in line, the quiet of sitting on a bus, the quiet of a morning table before the day fully began. In those small spaces, the mind would wander, not toward anything specific, just drifting. Thoughts would stretch out like slow-moving clouds, unfinished memories, fragments of plans, strange connections appearing and disappearing without urgency. Nothing was pulling at attention. Nothing was requesting it. Attention simply rested wherever it happened to land. If you watch closely, you can still find small remnants of this rhythm today. A person staring out of a train window, someone sitting on a bench, looking at nothing in particular, a child absent-mindedly tracing shapes in the dust with a stick. But these moments have become surprisingly rare, because the spaces that once held quiet now hold signals. A phone on the table, a small red circle in the corner of a screen, a soft vibration in a pocket, each one barely noticeable on its own. A tiny interruption, a gentle tap on the shoulder. But interruptions, like drops of water, accumulate. One drop is nothing, but a steady drip can carve patterns into stone. And so attention begins to change its shape. It becomes lighter, quicker, more easily pulled from place to place, like a leaf floating on a moving current. The modern environment is full of these currents. They move through glowing screens and wireless signals, through the architecture of apps and platforms designed to keep attention circulating rather than settling. Every notification carries a small promise, something new, something interesting, something socially meaningful, and the mind, built through millions of years to notice new information quickly, responds almost automatically. A flicker of curiosity, a brief surge of anticipation, a small shift of attention. Individually, these moments seem harmless, but underneath them, something deeper is happening. The rhythm of attention is quietly being rewritten, not through force, but through environment. Because attention, like water, tends to follow the shape of the landscape it moves through, and the landscape of modern life has become remarkably good at redirecting its flow. If you look closer, you begin to notice how constant this redirection has become. Workspaces filled with multiple open windows, conversations that pause every few minutes for incoming messages, a single task surrounded by a halo of possible distractions. The mind begins one thing, then another signal appears, a notification, a headline, a brief flash of novelty, and attention moves, not because it is weak, but because it is responding exactly as it evolved to respond. The brain did not develop in quiet rooms with glowing rectangles. It developed in open environments where noticing small changes could mean the difference between danger and safety. A sudden movement in the grass, a new sound in the distance, a change in the social atmosphere of a group. Attention became a survival tool, sensitive, flexible, always scanning. In the ancient landscape, this sensitivity was an advantage. But environments change faster than evolution does, and so the same sensitivity that once helped humans survive has entered a world filled with carefully engineered signals. Signals designed not just to be noticed, but to be irresistible. Underneath the surface of everyday life, an invisible structure has formed, a system that quietly competes for one of the most valuable resources the human mind possesses: attention. And once you begin to notice this structure, a different interpretation of that familiar moment appears. The moment when you sit down to focus and your attention drifts somewhere else. Perhaps the mind is not failing. Perhaps it is simply moving through the currents that now surround it. If you trace this pattern a little deeper, something interesting begins to emerge. Attention is often described as a personal trait, something a person either has or does not have, a matter of discipline, willpower, focus. But attention behaves less like a personality trait and more like a natural resource. Like water in a landscape, water does not decide where it flows. It follows gravity. It follows the shape of the terrain. A valley gathers it. A slope redirects it. A crack in the ground becomes a stream. Attention moves in much the same way. It gathers where the environment allows it to settle, and it scatters where the terrain becomes uneven. For most of human history, the landscape of attention was remarkably simple. The environment contained long stretches of uninterrupted experience, walking long distances, preparing food, watching firelight move slowly across a wall of stone. Even work itself had a rhythm that allowed attention to deepen. A farmer following the steady pattern of planting rows, a craftsperson shaping wood grain by grain, a writer sitting with ink and paper in a quiet room. The architecture of life allowed attention to descend slowly, like sediment settling in still water. Deep focus was not something people had to fight for. It was simply the natural resting state of the mind when nothing kept disturbing the surface. But environments change. And over the last 2 decades, the terrain surrounding attention has transformed faster than at any other moment in human history. The modern environment is not neutral, it is designed. Every notification tone, every infinite scroll, every small burst of colour that appears on a screen, each one is a carefully placed slope in the landscape, a gentle pull on attention, not strong enough to feel aggressive, just strong enough to redirect the flow. Consider the structure of a simple notification. A tiny vibration travels through the table. The phone screen lights up softly in the corner of your vision. For a moment, the room contains 2 worlds: the quiet task in front of you and a small glowing doorway to something new. The human brain is exceptionally sensitive to novelty. New information once meant survival, new food, new danger, new opportunity. So the mind turns, almost automatically. It takes only a fraction of a second, but the movement itself changes something. Attention, once beginning to settle, rises back to the surface, like water disturbed by a stone. And the modern environment is full of small stones, notifications, messages, headlines, short videos that end just quickly enough for the next one to begin, each one designed with a particular feedback rhythm: brief anticipation, brief reward, a small loop that invites repetition. Over time, the brain begins to adapt to this rhythm, not consciously, but structurally. Neural pathways strengthen around rapid shifts of attention. Focus becomes shorter, lighter, more flexible. The mind becomes very good at scanning, very good at switching, very good at absorbing small fragments of information. But the architecture of deep focus is different. Deep focus requires stillness. It requires attention to remain in one place long enough for complexity to unfold, for ideas to deepen, for patterns to slowly reveal themselves. And stillness is difficult to maintain when the environment keeps generating signals. Imagine trying to read a long novel in a room where someone taps you on the shoulder every 30 seconds, not aggressively, just gently, a light interruption. At first it feels manageable, then slightly irritating. Eventually the mind begins anticipating the tap itself, and once anticipation enters the system, attention never fully settles again. This is the hidden shift taking place in many modern environments. Attention is not simply being interrupted, it is being trained. The mind gradually learns that the next signal could appear at any moment, and so it hovers closer to the surface, watching, waiting, scanning for the next ripple. From the outside, this can look like distraction, but beneath the surface, something more structural is happening. The architecture of the environment is reshaping the architecture of attention itself, not through force, but through constant, quiet influence. And so the familiar experience of struggling to focus begins to look different, not like a personal weakness, but like a mind adapting to the terrain it now inhabits. A terrain full of signals, full of currents, full of invisible gravity, pulling attention in every direction at once. And when attention lives inside that kind of landscape, remaining still becomes a surprisingly difficult thing. Once you begin to see attention as something shaped by its environment, a quiet pattern starts appearing in many corners of modern life. Places where people feel tired without understanding why. Moments where the mind feels busy, yet strangely unproductive. A day filled with activity that somehow leaves very little behind. It often begins with something subtle. You sit down at your desk in the morning. The light from the window rests softly across the table. A laptop hums quietly. The task ahead is clear enough. But before the first thought fully forms, the mind is already holding several small threads. An unread message, a headline glimpsed earlier, a notification waiting somewhere on the phone. None of them urgent, but each one occupies a small corner of awareness. Attention begins the task, then briefly checks something else, then returns. The movement feels harmless, but every shift leaves a small residue behind, a fragment of unfinished thought, a thread the mind keeps loosely holding. Psychologists sometimes describe this as attention residue, not a dramatic disruption, just a faint echo of the previous activity, like stepping from one room into another while still hearing the conversation behind you. Over time, these echoes accumulate. The mind carries pieces of many places at once, and deep focus, something that requires full immersion, becomes harder to reach. It is similar to trying to sink beneath the surface of water while waves keep forming above you. Even small ripples are enough to keep the body floating near the top. And so attention begins to live at the surface of experience, quick, responsive, constantly shifting. This pattern quietly shapes more than just work. It begins to influence rest as well. Consider the moment at the end of the day when someone finally lies down. The room is dim. The phone rests nearby on the bedside table. The ceiling holds the soft shadow of a streetlight through the window. The body is tired, but the mind keeps moving. Small thoughts flicker past unfinished messages, things half read earlier, ideas that never fully formed. Attention moves quickly from one fragment to another, almost as if the mind is still scrolling. This is one of the quieter consequences of an environment filled with signals. When the day is full of interruptions, the mind never fully descends into a slower rhythm. It remains alert, lightly activated, hovering, and so rest itself begins to feel thinner, not absent, but less complete. The same pattern appears in conversations. Two people sitting across from each other at a table. For a moment, the exchange is warm and present. Words move easily between them. Then a phone lights up on the table, just a brief glance. But the small shift in attention is enough to change the atmosphere. The conversation pauses for a second longer than usual. The invisible thread of shared focus loosens slightly. Neither person may notice it consciously, but attention, like temperature, subtly shapes the emotional environment. When it becomes fragmented, connection often becomes lighter as well. Even creativity, the slow unfolding of ideas, feels this influence. Creative thought has a particular rhythm. It often begins with confusion, a vague sense of something forming beneath the surface. Then comes a period of wandering attention ideas, circling slowly, connecting unexpected pieces. This stage requires patience. It requires attention to stay with uncertainty long enough for patterns to emerge. But the modern environment is not particularly friendly to uncertainty. The moment the mind becomes slightly uncomfortable, a new piece of stimulation is available. A message, a video, a new stream of information, and the mind moves. The idea that was forming quietly beneath awareness dissolves before it has time to take shape, like a seed disturbed before it can root. None of this happens dramatically. There is no clear moment when attention breaks. Instead, the pattern spreads slowly across everyday life. Work becomes more fragmented. Rest becomes more restless. Conversations become slightly thinner. Ideas struggle to reach depth. From the inside, it can feel confusing. People often interpret these changes personally. They wonder why focus feels harder than it used to, why concentration slips away so easily, why the mind seems drawn toward distraction even when something meaningful is waiting. But when you step back and observe the architecture surrounding attention, another interpretation appears. The environment itself has changed. The landscape is filled with signals that constantly redirect the flow of awareness. And the human mind, remarkably adaptable, has simply learned to move within that landscape, not failing, not weakening, just responding to the currents that now surround it. When you look at this pattern long enough, something begins to soften. The quiet tension many people carry around focus starts to loosen slightly, because for a long time, the story has sounded very personal. A person sits down to work and struggles to stay with one task. The mind wanders. Attention drifts towards something easier, something brighter, something new. And in that moment, a familiar conclusion quietly forms. Something must be wrong with me. But environments have always shaped human behavior more than individuals tend to notice. A city shapes the way people walk. A house shapes the way people gather. The placement of a single chair can influence where conversations happen in a room. Human behavior often appears personal when it is actually architectural. Attention follows the same quiet rule. It responds to the structure surrounding it, the signals in the air, the objects within reach, the rhythms of interruption that pass through a day. Place a mind in an environment filled with constant novelty, and attention becomes alert, quick, responsive. Place the same mind in a quieter landscape, and something different begins to happen. The surface of awareness slowly settles, thoughts lengthen, time stretches slightly, attention begins to descend again, not through effort, but through environment. This is why certain places still feel strangely calming. A quiet library where the air holds the soft sound of pages turning. A long walk where the only rhythm is the steady movement of footsteps on pavement. A morning before the world begins sending signals. In these environments, the mind does not feel pressured to scan. There are fewer slopes pulling attention in different directions, and so awareness gathers itself naturally, like water pooling in a still basin. The modern world, however, rarely offers still basins by default. It offers currents, streams of information flowing continuously through glowing rectangles and invisible networks. These currents are not accidental. They are carefully engineered systems designed to keep attention moving, to keep it circulating. Because in the digital environment, attention itself has become a form of energy, a resource that powers platforms, markets, conversations, and entire economies. And so the landscape continues shaping itself around the gravity of attention. Signals become brighter, interruptions become smoother, new information arrives with less friction than ever before. From the outside, it can feel as if attention itself has become weaker. But what is actually happening is something more structural. The environment has become louder, not necessarily in sound, but in signals, in invitations, in small requests for attention appearing every few seconds. The human mind is simply responding the way it always has, turning toward novelty, scanning the horizon, adjusting to the conditions of the landscape it inhabits. And so the familiar experience of losing focus begins to look different, less like a personal flaw, more like a mirror, a reflection of the environment surrounding the mind, the currents it swims within, the invisible architecture shaping where attention flows. And once you begin to see this structure, a quiet realization begins to emerge. The mind may not be broken, it may simply be living inside a very noisy world. And so the question of focus becomes less about discipline and more about landscape. Attention moves the way rivers move, guided by slopes, shaped by currents, gathering where the terrain allows stillness. In a world filled with signals, the wandering mind may not be a failure at all, but simply a reflection of the environment it has learned to navigate.